This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast coming at you once again. Happy to be with you on a different night than we usually record, coming here live to you on a Tuesday night. Usually we're Wednesday night, but we're thankful that you're joining us regardless of the day change and a little bit of the schedule change. I am Anthony Cosenza, joined by John Sheeran, who is in a different venue than usual. A little bit of a different background. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. I'm actually in Northwest Ohio right now. I don't know if you consider Toledo, the general Toledo area, if that's Lions country or if that's still Browns country, but it's definitely not Bengals country right now.
It borders that, right? Borders
right,
that yeah. Well, happy to have you with us, man. For once in what seems like months, we don't really have a guest this week, so our listeners are relegated to listening to just you and I, my friend. That does not mean we do not have future guests lined up, but we just have a week off where it's going to be you and I talking some Bengals. Last week we had Marcus Bailey. We've had a lot of different guys on our show over the past handful of weeks, as have the other guys in our podcast channel, the Orange is the New Black podcast by Ace and Zim. By the way, Zim, I'm wearing your shirt, buddy. Thank you for the shirt. They've had Hushmanzada and Willie Anderson and Jeff Blake recently. They've just had a string of them, which is pretty cool. Matt Minnick's had some special guests as well on Chalk Talk episodes. And, it's been a good run for our channel, but we're letting the dust settle from everything. We're coming at you. We're going to go through a number of different items. Number one, we're going to go through a little bit of a what if scenario in terms of a historical situation or historical situations with this Cincinnati Bengals. We're going to talk about a specific free agent acquisition on the offensive line and a should they, shouldn't they argument or debate will ensue in terms of signing that player. And we'll continue our 9 for 9 positional preview series. John's taking the lead on that. And because we're going to be talking about a free agent offensive lineman, we're going to go with the offensive line this week and go through the preview. As usual, you can get this show on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play. You can get it on, I said iTunes, but you can also get it on iHeartRadio, Megaphone, Stitcher, Spotify, all that good stuff. YouTube, it's on cincyjungle.com. So subscribe to the channels, get the show how you can, leave us a review, and join us live whenever you are able. John, this is a little bit of I don't want to say a slow time because rookies are kind of getting ingrained in some things with the Cincinnati Bengals and even with the unique atmosphere of everything. They're doing some meetings. They're learning the playbooks. They're doing all of that kind of stuff, which is kind of a rookie mini camp type of thing. But news is still a little slow because there's no real on-field sessions. We're not getting actual on-field looks at some of these guys. So because of that, we wanted to go through a what-if scenario. They are two what-if scenarios that have been discussed about a lot, but we're going to put our own little spin on it. And a lot of podcasts within the SB Nation network have been doing some what-if series. So, of course, the big one would be what if – one of the big topics is what if X player wasn't injured during a specific period of time? What would have happened with your team? Well, the two that really come to mind in this with the Cincinnati Bengals and in recent history, of course, Carson Palmer, his knee injury in 2005 in that wild card game against the Steelers, and Andy Dalton's thumb injury in 2015, late in the year. It wasn't in the playoff game, but late in the year to cause him, by the way, against the Steelers as well, and caused him to miss the playoff game against the Steelers that the Bengals ultimately lost. We know that was a very infamous game in their history. Before we get to kind of a different framework of the what-if argument, I kind of wanted to get your overarching thoughts on both of those teams and both of those injuries in that situation with Palmer's injury, what could have been, and Andy Dalton, and what could have been in 2015.
So I think we have to both evaluate these teams with like the starting quarterback healthy for that playoff game, because ultimately you had two backups playing in that game, and that's ultimately one of the main reasons why they lost. But with Carson Palmer leading that offense with like you can compare the offensive lines of those two teams, and the 2015 team had Russell Bodine at center, 2005 team had Rich Bram. So, that offensive line in 2005 had 5 very good starters all throughout, all down the line. They didn't really have a tight end that could compete with Tyler Eifert, but your top 3 receivers of Chad Johnson, who I believe was either an All-Pro that year, or it was the year before he started making a couple All-Pro squads. TJ Hushmanzana and Chris Henry, and then Rudy Johnson's running back. That's in my opinion, it rivals very closely of some of those dominant Colts offenses when you had Peyton Manning, Marvin Harrison, Reggie Wayne, Dallas Clark, and those offensive linemen. Like when you talk about just the 2000s in general, that's maybe one of the most stacked offenses in general of that decade. And I think the main thing that separates the two is the defenses. Like you have 2015, which is a more well-rounded defense. You have 2 edge rushers, or you have 2 defensive linemen with over 70 pressures that season in Carl Dunlap and Geno Atkins. The 2005 defense, I remember us talking about that defense in general in the past on this program, is that they were really relying on turnovers. They didn't, there were games where they would give up, 30, almost 40 points a game, but, they would keep the offense, they would allow the offense to still win them because the defense was very opportunistic and was able to get the ball back in key situations. And whenever that offense had the ball, like they were a threat to score at any time. So there were different teams in that sense where the offense is more stacked, but you could rely on the 2015 defense on a more consistent basis.
That's kind of it's hard to argue with anything you said there. The 2015 team was, I think everyone could agree that it was more well-rounded in terms of being able to limit points, on defense, get after the quarterback a bit more. The occasional big play would come from Vontaze Burfict, but it was really kind of like you said, the defense in the 05 team was a bit more feast or famine, right? It was led up to big play, and then the very next drive, they'd come back with a clutch interception to set up the offense on a short field, and then Carson Palmer and company would usually take advantage of that. In 05, that offensive line was outstanding. The offensive line in 15 was very good as well. You still had Whitworth, you still had Zeitler on that 15 squad, but in 05, you had Bobby Williams, you had Willie Anderson, you had Levi Jones, Eric Steinbach, Richie Bram. Very, very good collection of offensive line players. So, there's an argument to be made about which team may have been better and which team, I think a lot of people probably preferred the quarterback play in 05 than they did in 15. And that's, maybe even not by much, because Andy Dalton was having an MVP-like year in 2015. It was a very solid year. So 2 very, very good teams, and 2 teams that, as you look back, it's just kind of like, oh, what could have happened, man? What could have happened? What could have been if not for the injuries? Now, Carson Palmer's was far more severe, and it was actually kind of hard to believe he came right back that next year based on the amount of damage that was done to his leg. If you listen to the interview, it was with Willie Anderson on Orange is the New Black with Ace and Zim. Willie recounted that sequence of events, and they heard Carson let out this ungodly shriek on the field. It's kind of harrowing to hear Willie Anderson recount that sequence of events. And he kind of said, even though we had the lead at halftime and all that kind of stuff, we knew that we just weren't going to win that game without Carson Palmer. So, there are a lot of what ifs. A lot of people say, okay, in 05, had Carson not been hurt, not only would they have beaten the Pittsburgh Steelers at home, but they would have also potentially gone to and or won the Super Bowl. I don't hear as many people necessarily say that in 15, maybe because Andy Dalton didn't get hurt in that game or what have you. But where we're going with this is, what team do you think maybe had a better shot at going all the way? That's kind of the what if. What if Carson Palmer was healthy? What if Andy Dalton was healthy in 15? Those 2 teams are primed here. There's not the freak injuries. Thank you again, Steelers. There's not the freak injuries that occurred to both of those guys at different points in the season. is there a Bengals curse that is inevitably going to occur? Were they going to stumble against the Steelers regardless, like they always do? Or were these teams primed, and the way the quarterbacks were playing, were they both ready to make a pretty far run? And what I want to bring up before you go on, John, I'm going to bring up a little bit. I'm going to do some research on some of the bracketing of those years, and we can kind of see who both of those squads would have faced theoretically had they gotten past that first round.
Right. So just quickly searching, and Anthony will bring this up for our live viewers to look. Had that 05 team beaten the Steelers, they were the 3 seed, so they would have played the number 2 seed Denver Broncos at Mile High, which is always hard to play there on the road, and especially in a playoff atmosphere. And that would have been, coming off their first playoff win in, at the time, 15 or 16 years. So, the emotions would obviously be very high. You exceed a level of success that you haven't in almost a generation's amount of time. And, that Denver team, it had Jake Plummer coming off a really good year. You had Rod Smith at wide receiver, who was the main running back in that team. That was Mike Anderson at running back, who I don't really remember that much, but apparently had 12 rushing touchdowns that year. And Champ Bailey, who was an all-pro on defense, and John Lynch. So that would have been a tough secondary for that offense to go up against. But I think about, comparing these two teams. Yes, the defense at 05 was more suspect, but I think if you had a gun to your head and you said, I need a quarterback in a primetime game to lead a game-winning drive or just play consistently for 4 quarters, and it was between Carson Palmer and Andy Dalton, regardless of how well Andy Dalton was playing throughout the regular season that year, I would take Carson Palmer in a hypothetical situation. And, I understand Dalton played extremely well in 2015. It was undoubtedly his best year. He was definitely in the MVP conversation. What's a weird irony here is that if you look at the numbers that matter in 2015 from a quarterback production standpoint, Carson Palmer kind of played better than Andy Dalton when he was in Arizona. And that was one of the primetime games that the Bengals had that season. It was at Arizona. And I think Dalton played fairly well in that game, but ultimately it was another primetime loss. And that was the second primetime loss of that season. The first one came against the Houston Texans. That was off their 8-game winning streak to open the season. So, even with Dalton healthy and playing as well as he did in that stacked offense in 2015, there was still some reasonable doubt that if he got to the playoffs, some of the same issues would have arisen. You definitely saw him take turn a corner, if you will, in this fifth year. You started to see him starting to elevate other players around him, but it was also an ideal situation for him to succeed the way he did. With Palmer, I don't think you ever had that doubt. He was a first overall pick in his second year as a starter. And if you want to compare offenses again, that 2005 team, it just reigns more elite to me. I know if you want to go player by player, you might have the argument that AJ Green was better than Chad Johnson, even though Chad Johnson was fantastic with Palmer. But it was actually something that Chad Johnson said with Willie Anderson when they had their Instagram live conversation about a week ago. They talked about Chris Henry, and obviously the one thing we remember about Chris Henry is unfortunately how his life ended a few years after this. But that's how that playoff game started. It was a bomb to Chris Henry, and Chad was talking to Willie Anderson about he was the closest thing in his mind to Randy Moss on just pure deep ball attacking ability. Like the way that he could accelerate under these moon balls from Carson, who, had an amazing arm in his own right. Just that, piece to that offense is something that 2015 couldn't really replicate. Marvin Jones is decent in those situations, but he couldn't hold a candle to Chris Henry in those situations. If Palmer was healthy in that playoff game against the Steelers, I think everybody with a mind of football knows that they would have won that game. Pittsburgh, was the 6th seed, a wild card team. And, if they went on to play Denver, I think it would have been a close game. But after that, then I think you play the number 1 seed. Pittsburgh beat, Indianapolis, after they won that game. But presumably you would have played, Indianapolis if either the Patriots or Jaguars beat that team. But I still think that, I'm taking the better quarterback who's surrounded by the better offense, even if the defense is slightly more suspect. I think even with the season that Dalton had, I wouldn't trust him compared to Carson in that situation.
So here's my thing, and talking about the 05 team, I circle here with an imaginary marker the Colts. I circle them because that is a team, I believe, earlier in that season, the Bengals and hosted Indianapolis and lost a shootout at home to Peyton Manning. I think it was the score. I'd have to pull it up, but I think it was in the 40-something to 30-something, or it was crazy. Zero defense was played. So I think if the Bengals had to go to Indianapolis, ironically, I don't know if you remember the Steelers beating the Colts. If you remember this game, John, there was a play where I think Jerome Bettis fumbled and late in the game, and a defensive back, his name escapes me, for the Colts had it and somehow could not escape because he had some sort of domestic incident earlier in the week where he was stabbed in the leg or something. And so he was kind of hindered in terms of his speed because that was healing up. Ben Roethlisberger just happened to trip him up. And I think the Colts either, they didn't end up getting a touchdown when it seemed like he was going to run all the way with that. And then Pittsburgh ends up winning that game. But I think that's where maybe the Bengals would have hit the buzzsaw, and I think, like you mentioned, that probably would have been maybe more the championship round based on how the seedings went. Isn't that kind of how that would have? Yeah. So I don't know that the Bengals necessarily would, just because of what had happened earlier that year in their shootout loss against the Colts. By the way, that was the game, if you remember, that was the game that Chad Johnson proposed to a Bengals cheerleader on the sideline after a touchdown catch. So that's the game I'm referencing. I think that's probably where the team would have maybe hit the buzzsaw. But it's a similar argument could maybe be made for the 2015 team. And granted, this is a big hypothetical because we're talking about, we didn't even see Andy Dalton in the playoffs, and we know that Marvin Lewis and the rest of the Cincinnati Bengals are not that great in primetime. Andy Dalton specifically was not very, very good in primetime either. I'm going to pull up the bracket here so we can see the 2015 bracket, and we can kind of compare and contrast that one too. That might have – my argument with it is really, could the defense have done more to aid the team in a longer run in 15 than they would have been able to do in 05? Again, that was you've got the Patriots that the Bengals would have faced, and potentially once again the Broncos and other Peyton Manning. I think Peyton Manning was on that team at that point too. So that's kind of the road to the Super Bowl there. How do you feel about some of those matchups from there?
Yeah, so I mean, anytime you play the Patriots at Foxborough, that's tough. So would that have been the divisional round or the championship round?
Let me see here. I believe they would have had to have gone to Gillette and play New England in the divisional round.
Right. So again, and I think that was
because I think they had lost to New England earlier that year. And I think with the Bengals, they were 12-4 that year. I think New England maybe was a 13-3. I'll have to double check that, but I think they would have had to have gone to New England in the divisional round had they gotten past Pittsburgh.
Well, I don't think they played New England in 2015. They played them in 2014.
Okay, then I'm getting confused.
Right. I think they did have a tiebreaker, and I think the argument was, had Dalton not gotten hurt, then the Bengals probably would have been able to maybe get that second seed or like some type of a bye. But even if they did have the bye and Dalton got hurt, then there was the argument of maybe he can come back, or maybe he could be able to start in that game after they had the bye week. But again, I think my concerns would have been exemplified or just validated if Andy Dalton in a playoff setting, and the Bengals in that case with Marvin Lewis, being however many years, like 13 years into his tenure at Cincinnati, had to gone into New England and face the buzzsaw, the Patriots at home in the playoffs. A setting where really only the Titans and the Ravens in recent years, or maybe in the last 20 years, have been able to be successful in that type of setting. It would have been possible because, again, that team was obviously super talented, and there was a chance that, like you said, the defense could have been able to do enough, kind of like that 2013 game where obviously they got a lot of luck from the weather, but the defense just did a fantastic job of limiting Brady, and they had some moments like that where they were able to minimize the damage from a good quarterback. But Geno Atkins would have had to been basically on one and been in Brady's lap or Brady's face the entire game to disrupt anything that they had going on. Again, it's just hard for me to say, even with how talented and how well-rounded that team was, that they would have been able to go into New England, and for me to confidently say that they would have been able to beat them. I just think in comparing these two, I would be more confident in the Bengals rematching with the Colts, like you said, after that shootout, than beating the Colts rather than just the Bengals beating the Patriots on the road in the playoffs, from everything that we knew about Marvin Lewis and that team up to that point.
I'm seeing a couple of entertaining comments in the live chat. Carolyn Reiner says Andy would have choked. Some people are saying Palmer would have done something. David Gabbard also brings up an interesting point. The playoff game against the Jets, Carson couldn't hit the broadside of a barn or backside of it, either one. Nobody did anything that game, and that seemed to be a very winnable game. That's where, and you bring up interesting points about both teams, John, where in this hypothetical scenario, or these hypothetical scenarios, plural, the Bengals under Marvin Lewis, I think they had one win in 6 total tries against Tom Brady. I think it was the same type of record against Peyton Manning, whether that was at home or on the road for both teams. It was pretty deplorable. It didn't matter what quarterback, whether it was Palmer or Dalton. It didn't matter which quarterback it was. The Bengals did not fare well against those teams, and the chances are that both of those teams would have had to face those. Both one or both, or that's just how the AFC gauntlet always played out when it came to the playoffs. You either had to go through Manning or Brady or both. I mean, that's just kind of how it went. And the Bengals never really proved that they were very good at getting past those guys, much less the Pittsburgh Steelers, injuries or not. So to kind of close up this argument, because we've got some more to get to here, you would say you felt as if the 05 team maybe had a little bit better shot to get further had it not been for the injury than the 15 team had it not been for the Dalton injury.
Yes, I'm pretty confident in that. And we talked about the 05 defense as well, but I'm looking at some of those games from that year. The first 9 games when they were 7-2, like they only had, I think, one game where they gave up more than 23 points on defense. So and that was the Steelers earlier in that year. So it was really the back half of that year where that defense started to, lose a little traction there, and I guess it kind of carried over into the playoffs as well. But again, like if it comes down to you have more confidence in one quarterback playing more consistent in that type of setting, and you're still dealing with a Marvin Lewis who was only in his, I think, 3rd year as a head coach, you would have had more confidence that he would have been able to overcome some of the things that he ended up struggling later on had that gone differently, right? And it's hard to tell, I guess, how Andy Dalton would have finished that season had he stayed healthy, because they had some tough games stand out. I think the main one was that Broncos game. I think it was on a Monday night when A.J. McCarron basically fumbled away their chances of winning, and ultimately fumbled their chances at a bye week appearance. So how Andy would have handled that situation could have maybe affected the perception of his season in general, and how confident fans would have been of him going into that scenario. So it's an interesting hypothetical, to say the least. I think both teams have different positives and negatives, but at the end of the day, I would just be more confident in one team's quarterback over the other, even if his defense is not exactly up to snuff.
Yeah, hard to argue with that. I guess I would. It's funny. It's almost as if the 15 team and its well-roundedness seemed to be better for the 05 era of football, whereas the pass-happy 05 Bengals and the offensive juggernaut that was the 05 Bengals would have been, a little bit more for this era's brand of football. But hard to argue with that. I want to leave it with this, and I don't want to keep talking about negative and what ifs and all that kind of stuff. And plus, we've got some news that we're calling an audible on the program. But before we do that, I just kind of want to say, what do you think was more damaging to the Bengals' psyche inside of that locker room, that 0-5 loss or the way that 15 played out? Because we know after 0-5, the Bengals stumbled. They lost like 4 in a row in 0-6 to not make the playoffs. By the way, lost to the Steelers at the end of the season in 0-6 again, to miss that one. Then 0-7, more downhill. 0-8 was a terrible season. Then they made it again in 0-9. And then obviously from 15, you have 2016 through 2019 that have been pretty poor years.
We still talk about the 0-5 with like a certain amount of pain in our hearts. Whereas like, because we thought that if Carson was healthy that game, that they were for sure going to win. When in reality, like, you know, at the end of the day, it was still like a double-digit loss to the Steelers in the playoffs. Whereas that 16 game, they had the lead up until like the last 2 minutes or up until the last second. So I don't know. I feel like that 2016 loss basically sealed the deal of that window, essentially the Lewis era and the Dalton era. Basically, like that's as far as they're going to get. I don't think they're going to recover from this, especially if they allow these players to leave in free agency and they're not going to do anything in free agency. But I don't know. I just think having this discussion and realizing that the 2005 team had a better chance, I think that still leaves a bigger sting. And I think it means something if we're still talking about it like this, 15 years later. So I think it was more damaging from the 2016 one because they had like a legitimate chance to win, even with everything that happened. But you still can't look back at that 2005 game and think of anything different because it still stings.
Yeah, I would say 15 just because of what has ensued since, including a tie for a team record of the worst record last year. That was really a symbolic of a window closing. I feel like, because they had made a handful of playoff berths before that, and that just seemed like, even though it was the Steelers, it just seemed like that was their best chance, really. A complete team. Andy was playing well. It just seemed like that was their best chance to really finally get over the hump. And and the way that they lost, the PR nightmare and fallout that came, especially towards some of those players, that to me was a little bit more damaging because you felt like in 0-5, well, yeah, Carson got hurt, but it's the first playoff appearance. He's still a young quarterback. He can come back. We've got all these pieces in place. Maybe the window was just opening at that point.
Right. I totally agree.
Well, as I mentioned, having a fun little conversation on hypotheticals here. We had a little change in tonight's order, so we're adding a little more to the plate. We're not taking away anything, but we're adding a little more to the plate. One of the things we wanted to do was to talk about with other media members, bloggers, folks associated with other AFC North teams to see how they feel their team is doing after this offseason, how they drafted, the outlook of them in 2020, and get their opinion on the Cincinnati Bengals. So we have a special guest coming on in just a little bit. We didn't think he was going to be able to join us at the onset of the show, but now it appears he is going to. His name is Justin, and he has a really cool YouTube channel, Ingraven Vids. And by the way, this is brought to us by a listener. He said, have you seen this guy's channel? It's really cool. And we're happy to have him. He's going to join us in a few minutes to talk about the Baltimore Ravens, preview them. He actually has done some videos on the Cincinnati Bengals, some of their draft selections. He kind of does a little bit more bite-sized videos, really entertaining guy. So we are going to have him on in just a few minutes. So a little bit of an audible, but we're going to bring you more content, and we hope to get more bloggers, more media members, etc., to talk about the Steelers and the Browns coming up, just so you get a peek on over to the other side of the fence in terms of AFC North teams. Obviously going to be a very competitive division. So we'll be joined by Justin in just a few minutes here. But before we do, John, let's take a few minutes to talk about Larry Warford. An interesting free agent, that a guard, obviously a need that the Cincinnati Bengals have. Their offensive line is a bit still in flux. They seem to collect guards, at least they did last year, and they've done so again this year. It sounds like he may be looking at $7 million or so a year after being cut by the New Orleans Saints. He's under 30, a 3-time Pro Bowler. What do you think about the possibility of Larry Warford joining the Bengals in terms of realism and fit and need?
There's multiple ways that we can look at this. Let's start with the likelihood of it even happening. I think from the Bengals standpoint, they look at Warford. He's going to turn 29 in July. He's still a really good player. Maybe not the player that he was with the Lions a few years ago, but still that would be the best guard on the roster. And they have to recognize that from just a pure scouting perspective. They see him and they think, okay, if we want to sign this guy, we want to get him on some type of a multi-year deal, like they did with Xavier Su'a-Filo back in March. They signed him to 3 years, $10 million. A 3-year deal for Warford based on what he's looking for, that would come in the range of like the mid 20 millions in terms of total money. I don't know how much guaranteed money he would get, but I don't think that's exactly what Warford's looking for right now. I think when you look at him, who's been to 3 Pro Bowls, who's coming off of a team that is one of the big Super Bowl contenders in the NFL and the Saints, you got to think that he's looking for something that can reset his market back in 2021. So you're thinking of probably a 1-year prove-it deal for Larry Warford. And if that's the case, the Bengals should still do that. I think there's no excuse to see Larry Warford on the open market, to have the amount of cap space that they have. It's not at least take a crack at it. And that's the only way that I think you're going to attract Larry Warford. But I think in their mind, they want something that, is not just a 1-year rental deal, not just to boost up his stock and whatever. So it doesn't seem like a fit in terms of Warford's eyes. There's also the Xavier Su'a-Filo aspect to this, because everything that we've read about Su'a-Filo is that they signed him to start at right guard, not to compete for one of the guard spots, but they signed him to start at right guard. And that might just be PR from the team because that's the direction that they want to go. And Warford wasn't available to sign at that point. But I do think that it would be odd for them to sign Warford and then to just flat out bench Su'a-Filo, who I don't think is worth, crowning as a starter unquestionably. He's just not that caliber of player, especially compared to Warford. But it would just seem very uncharacteristic for the Bengals to go out and sign a guard that they want to start at right guard for 3 years, and then to basically dump that plan after 2 months without him playing any snaps. So the only way that they could do this is if they do sign him for a 1-year deal and then move Su'a-Filo to left guard and basically have him, be the week 1 starter there, because that's the position Su'a-Filo played in, Houston and Dallas. That's the only tape that they have on him, and that's what they're confident that, because they like the recent tape that they have of Su'a-Filo. So it makes sense in that way. And then there's finally the whole cap space issue with this, because right now, if you calculate the projected rookie pool, which is going to take about $7.5 million from the cap space, that puts them at about $17 million for week 1. And we know that even with the plethora of spending that they had this offseason, they're going to probably roll over about $8 to $10 million. So it's not truly $17 million in space. You're probably looking at maybe $8 or $9 million left in space. If that's eaten up by Warford, you have to wonder, okay, what about Joe Mixon? If he's going to be a definite candidate for an extension, he's going to get more money than the $1.7 million he's expected to count against the cap this year. So if they're thinking about either signing Warford to a 1-year deal or for sure getting a Joe Mixon extension, which we can talk about, how smart that is, but it seems to be like the plan of action. I don't think in their mind they think there's enough space, because this team will always they'll never be right up against the cap. They'll always leave about $8 to $10 million for some type of emergency signs where they have to sign, a guard in case something happens, like they did last year with John Jerry. So it's feasible, and there's a path to do this without completely, giving up on Su'a-Filo, which I don't think would happen anyways. But in terms of likelihood, I just don't see the likelihood.
I don't see a likelihood either. And the main reason, the salary cap and all of that, the main reason is because of one of the later points you mentioned in Joe Mixon extension, possible working out some things for a long-term extension with AJ Green. Now, a long-term extension for AJ Green actually could potentially increase their cap space. But I mean, needless to say, that I think that is where their off-season focus is now shifting to those. So, maybe if you do a Mixon extension and an AJ Green extension, that maybe just kind of offsets cap space that you would get from AJ. You know what I'm saying? Like it would, you'd raise it, you'd lessen it with a Mixon extension, but then you'd bring it back down a little bit with a possible Green extension, maybe. And so it's just kind of a wash. But I do think that is kind of, I think that plays into this whole thing. And I also think that the team also likes to have a windfall, even though it's an old pre-Zach Taylor practice and a pre-2020 free agency approach practice. It is a team that, or the idea is the team really likes to have an in-season windfall for potential street free agents in case there's injuries, in case there's certain situations that they need to bring in some of these guys. So, and they need to have that money to do that. They also like to roll over some money, as you mentioned, John. Whatever that ends up being down the road, we don't know. But it just doesn't seem feasible to this point. I think there are some things that make it sound like a good fit for the team in terms of a need, but I also think we've said this so many times. They like the offensive line and who's here much more than we do. It is painfully obvious by their only addition being Hakeem Adeniji and Xavier Su'a-Filo in the offseason.
And I think it would be different, whereas because they went out and cut John Miller before they signed Su'a-Filo, so they were like for sure they did not want Miller back, and then they basically had a hole at right guard. And then they signed Su'a-Filo to a 3-year deal. Now, it technically is a 1-year deal. It doesn't have like barely any guaranteed money to him. But it just seems odd that they would be willing to bring in another guy to compete with him at that spot. And again, I don't think Su'a-Filo was a guy that you crown as a starter. But based off of what we know, what we read, and what we can infer from the situation, it just seems like they're comfortable with him regardless of who's available on the market. It makes sense to bring him in because he improves your offensive line, but I just think the fit here is not as well custom made as some people want to make it as.
Yeah, the other issue is, the problem last year was the team collected guards and they never really did anything at tackle, thus resigning them when injuries inevitably hit there, resigning them to the need to play guards, guys. John Jerry, lifetime guard, suiting up at left tackle. And so that's the other thing is I like the idea of Larry Warford. I think, especially if he comes affordable, even if it's a rental deal, whatever, and it helps keep your rookie quarterback upright. I like all of that. Some of the PFF scores are pretty favorable in terms of Warford and what he brings. But, I think that the team would be better served maybe looking at a tackle market, even if it's a lesser talent, the tackle market post June 1, post final cuts for somebody to contribute at the outside offensive line spots instead of spending a lot of money for a guy that may be only a short-term solution in a group that they already seem to like the faces they have that they've collected.
Yeah. And if Larry Warford's a tackle, I think this becomes a much more intriguing conversation. Whereas if they had an option at tackle that they liked in the draft, which clearly they didn't until Hakeem Adeniji, then I think you would have had a more interesting conversation. Whereas, because Bobby Hart and Fred Johnson, they knew who they had there, but they want to see Johnson more at tackle. But if they have an option where they can get a clear upgrade and they didn't do anything to solidify that spot, then I just think those situations are different. So I definitely agree with you there.
Well, as of now, Larry Warford remains a free agent in the NFL. Obviously, a name connected to, in some ways, connected to the Bengals, more out of fan desire than really true rumor mill right now. And I think also just this is a guy that I don't know if he'll sit out there for a really long time, but teams are starting to get in their rookies and starting to get however they can in this landscape. They're starting to get guys in there that they think can that they want to coach up and teach up right now. And then maybe as training camps ensue, this may be a guy that, comes in down the road as an acquisition.
Yeah, I agree.
This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. He's John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. Happy to have you with us. You can get this show on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, Megaphone, iHeartRadio. Our stuff is on YouTube, as you may be watching it live right now. We also stream on the Cincy Jungle Facebook page. All of our stuff is on cincyjungle.com. So subscribe to our channels, subscribe to our YouTube channel, get notified when we take the air live and join us then, or get notified when our material is available after the fact. As I mentioned, we called a little bit of an audible tonight, and we have a special guest with us. Very happy to have him with us to kick off kind of our AFC North post-off-season move breakdown, I guess. And it is Justin from Ingraven Vids. And Justin, for those unfamiliar, he's a guy who's got close to 30,000 YouTube subscribers to his channel. He does a great job covering the Ravens, covering the NFL, covering the AFC North teams. Happy to have him with us. I've been hounding him and not giving him a lot of time to prepare to come on, but I appreciate you coming on. How you doing, Justin?
No, it's all good. I appreciate you having me. How you doing, Anthony? How you doing, John?
Pretty good, man.
Well, yeah. Well, again, to be honest with you, we had a listener turn me on to your channel, and I watched some of your stuff. Was not overly aware of it beforehand, but I love the stuff that you're putting out there, man. Just before we kind of dive into some of the questions we got for you, can you let some of our listeners know where to check out your stuff and get in touch with you, listen to your stuff, all that good?
Well, yeah, I'm just primarily on YouTube. My channel is called Ingraven Vids, where I am a Ravens fan, but we just talk NFL football period on there. It is mostly Ravens, but it's just football in general. So fans of any team are welcome. It's family-friendly content, so anybody can watch it, no matter how old, how young you are, or anything in between. We have a lot of fun on there. We do a lot of live streaming. It is daily content, so you will see at least one, usually at least two, but at least one video every single day. So it's always going to be something new. It'll keep you updated with everything that's going on. And like I said, we just have a lot of fun on there. It's a super chill, laid back channel. And it's not uptight and all formal and everything like that. It's really relaxed. So everybody's welcome.
Well, that's awesome. Like I said, I have watched some of your videos since being introduced to your channel, and very impressed. Happy to have you with us. Normally we have others within the SB Nation network of blogs, but because of the quality that you're putting out there, we wanted you to come on here and talk some Ravens and maybe a little Bengals with us if you're willing and able. And what's cool about your channel too, by the way, to our listeners, you've got, we kind of do longer shows for our channel, but you kind of do some smaller shows, you do some longer ones, you kind of mix it up, which is pretty cool. So there's kind of some bite-sized stuff and some longer stuff. So really, really like your channel, and I want to encourage our listeners to go subscribe and check out Justin's channel if and when you can. Justin, I just want to kind of start right now. Ravens kind of had a surprising early exit last season. I'll just twist the knife right away. Had a surprising early exit, but they did a ton of work this offseason. I feel that their draft class was amazing. Some others, maybe the guy next to me, isn't as hot on them. I felt that their draft class was incredible. How do you feel that this team has positioned itself going forward in 2020 after such an amazing year, albeit a little shorter than most fans would have liked to have seen it end?
Yeah, they attacked the majority of their weaknesses this offseason, and I think this entire offseason for the Ravens, it was centered around that playoff game. And what I always say on my channel is that when speaking about the Ravens, every move that they made this offseason is remember the Titans. Because the Ravens in that game, they could not set the edge. So what do? They go get Calais Campbell. They go sign Derek Wolfe. They draft Justin Madubuike. So guys that can set the edge. And guys that are disruptive too. They couldn't get any real pressure, any consistent pressure on Ryan Tannehill. And even throughout the entire regular season, the pressure that they brought, it was very inconsistent. Even when they would rush 5, they would rush 6. It would just be inconsistent, and it wouldn't be getting back there. So they addressed the defensive line. One of their weaknesses and something that became a hole for them was the linebacker position. Last year, they had Josh Bynes, who is now a Bengal, and they had L.J. Fort. They had Patrick Onwuasu, who's now a Jet. So they definitely had some holes at inside linebacker, but through the draft, they got one Patrick Queen. Initially, with that draft pick, I wasn't a big fan, but because of the lack of experience. But I did watch more film on him, and it grew on me. It took a little bit of time, but it did grow on me a lot. But Malik Harrison, he was my favorite pick. He was my favorite pick. And then the running game. Running game, the Ravens clearly had the best running game in the league last year. But they addressed the draft in one of those rich get richer type of moves. We're getting a J.K. Dobbins from Ohio State, a complete running back, because they, of course, have Mark Ingram. He's going to be, I believe, 30 or 31 during this season. They have Gus Edwards, who is on the last year of his contract, and they have Justice Hill as well. But they added J.K. Dobbins in the second round. And I know a lot of people weren't big fans of that pick, and it did catch some people off guard. But they are a team that really likes drafting best player available. They don't like really drafting for need, and that was clearly one of those best player available picks. But it's somebody that can come in and, like I said, be a complete back, because they don't have anybody that can hit the home run and catch passes out of the backfield. They got some fast players now, like Justice Hill, but he can't really break tackles like that. He's not a physical running back. They have some physical running backs, but they like Gus Edwards, but he doesn't really catch passes out of the backfield. And Mark Ingram, he can catch passes out of the backfield and he's physical, but he can't hit that home run ball. So that's why they got a J.K. Dobbins, somebody that can do it all. And they really, this offseason has just been about, in the Titans game as well, the receivers were dropping a lot of passes. Mm-hmm. They were dropping so many passes. And the Ravens drafted one Devin Duvernay and James Prochet, two wide receivers who just rarely dropped the ball at all throughout their entire collegiate career. So those were some very important moves. Now, I don't think they're done at wide receiver yet. Even with them obviously having Hollywood Brown and Miles Boykin too. I just and Willie Snead, I don't think they're done at wide receiver yet. I think they'll still end up trading for a veteran. Who that is, I'm not sure, but I don't think they're done yet. But again, I think just this entire offseason for the Ravens has been about fixing what happened against the Titans.
So when looking at that draft, a lot of names stand out. There's a lot of names that I think were at least at the top of most people's boards when they were drafted by the Ravens. And I think that's why it is a universally loved class. I think I look at it and, there's some questionable positions that were addressed early, but, like you said, the Ravens are a talented team and they're able to kind of go with that strategy. I was really interested, and again, like the Ravens can do this because they can, trade for Calais Campbell for a 5th round pick and ship off Hayden Hurst and Chris Wormley for a couple of late round picks. So they're obviously, wizards at, acquiring draft capital. The Duvernay pick, though, it intrigues me because when studying him, it seems like he's an odd fit in an offense with Lamar Jackson. Can you expand upon what really his plan is in that offense and how they intend to incorporate him? Because, he's a fast guy, but he's not really a guy that can stretch the field. And I think that's what Bengals fans typically see, in that Lamar Jackson offense. Can you kind of expand upon what Duvernay's role is to be in this offense as whatever type of, where he is on the depth chart, I guess, as a rookie?
I think where he'll come in, I think he'll be primarily like a slot receiver. And I think he'll end up taking over for Willie Snead. Because Willie Snead, he's a cool slot receiver, but he doesn't have that breakaway speed, or he doesn't have that sort of big playability. He'll catch the ball, and then the first person usually that comes to wrap him up, that's it. But with Devin Duvernay, I think he has more speed than Willie Snead, and he has more big playability. He has more yards after the catch ability. So I think that's going to be the biggest thing that he adds to this offense, more so in the future. But I think they'll definitely use him this year too.
Talking with Justin at Ingraven Vids, a highly watched, highly subscribed YouTube channel, one of the kind of insider guys for the Baltimore Ravens and the NFL, joining us on the Orange and Black Insider. Happy to have him. Just my quick thoughts on the Ravens wide receiver group. It seems to me Duvernay actually fits a mold like a Torrey Smith, like the smaller, fast guys, like Hollywood Brown. You mentioned him. It just kind of seems like he fits a little bit in that mold that the Ravens usually like to get in terms of stretching the field. Mm-hmm. We did get this question on the other side of the ball, and you mentioned that he is now on the Cincinnati Bengals after being with the Ravens last year. Josh Bynes. To me, he's been a journeyman guy, mm-hmm. and for some reason last year, especially when I watched the 2 games against the Ravens, I'm like, who the heck is this guy? He's everywhere. Who is this guy? And he just seemed to play very well for the Ravens last year, and now he's with the Cincinnati Bengals. Was this just a scheme thing? the fact that the Ravens just know how to plug and play linebackers and make stars out of that position, or is this a guy who's kind of like finding his stride all of a sudden late in his career?
With Josh Bynes, he's always been a very smart player. He was actually on the Ravens Super Bowl team back in 2012, so it was a reunion of sorts. But Josh Bynes, he veteran linebacker. I think Bengals fans are gonna really love him. I'm sure many probably didn't know much about him, but he's gonna be good, man. If he's anything like he was last year, he's gonna be good. Is he the fastest? No. Is he a short tackler? Yes, he's a short tackler. And what he does, where he lacks in athleticism, he makes up for it with the football knowledge. Josh Bynes, I saw so many plays from him last season to where if he was just a bit faster, then it would have been an interception. If he was a bit faster, then it would have been a tackle for a loss or whatnot. But he knows how to dissect plays. He knows how to analyze plays. Like I said, he has the football smarts, man, big time. So that's what Bengals fans are going to really like from him. And I know the Bengals, they did draft a couple of linebackers later on in the draft. So those guys, they're going to be able to learn from a Josh Bynes because, again, that football knowledge, man, when you have veteran presence like that, especially as a rookie, because I believe they drafted two rookie linebackers, but they're going to want to take notes, man. They're going to want to take notes, and they're going to watch what Josh Bynes does and how he got to where he is. And those guys could benefit because they will have the athleticism since they are much younger guys. So if you can learn the football knowledge from him and use your athleticism, that's going to be able to push you up on that depth chart in the future.
Something that I actually had to remind myself of this when thinking about the Ravens was that Marshall Yonder retired actually earlier this year, and you guys drafted a couple of guards in the mid rounds of the draft. Who has the inside track to really take over for Yonder? Is it someone on the roster? Is it one of Ben Bredesen or Tyree Phillips who you drafted? I think
it would actually be DJ Fluker, who used to play for the Chargers and used to play for the Seahawks too. He was recently signed. It just became official like a few days ago, but they announced it a couple weeks ago. But I think it will be DJ Fluker. The reason I think it will be Fluker is because the Ravens, they're not just in win now mode, but they're in win Super Bowl now mode. So, yeah, you could go with one of the younger guys, and that'd be cool if one of them got a shot. And you never know, but I think with having a veteran on the interior of the offensive line, especially being in win Super Bowl now mode, I think you're going to want to go with somebody that's been here, done that. And not to say that a rookie can't come in and put in work, but I think they're going to go with the veteran with DJ Fluker. So I think he would actually have the inside track right now on winning that starting job at right guard to replace Marshall Yonder.
Talking with Justin at Ingraven Vids. Happy he's able to join us, talk a little Ravens. He'll be with us for a couple more minutes if he's willing and able. It's a good segue before we kind of get your thoughts on maybe the Bengals side of things from their offseason. How much do you think that the Ravens really improved themselves with what they've done this year? And do you see, you said they're in a Super Bowl now mode. Do you see that's, I mean, it's easy to say now in May, but do you see that really in their future as soon as 2020 based on what they've done this offseason?
Based on what they did, yes. But the biggest question now for the Ravens, for them to get over that hump, excuse me, obviously they have to win in the playoffs, but the biggest question mark now for the Ravens is how coaching is going to handle these players, how coaching is going to handle games moving forward. Because one thing that I always say about the Ravens is that they can have the best teams on paper. They can have a better team on paper than their opponent any week. But every single year, I feel like coaching, they lose 2 to 3 games every single season just based off of poor coaching. And the 2 games that they did it last year was against the Chiefs and against the Titans. Chiefs was obviously a regular season game, and the Titans was a playoff game. And with the Titans, they just didn't play that game at all. Mark Ingram, he was still recovering off of the calf injury, so he wasn't 100%. And between Mark Ingram and Gus Edwards, they ran the ball 9 times. If you led the league in rushing, that was your bread and butter. That rush set up the pass, that rush set up the play action. That rush did so many things for your team. You literally broke records that have been around for like 50 years. But they went into the playoff game and they didn't play that game. And there was no question why they lost. So that's the biggest question for me next on how coaching is going to be with the players, and more so how coaching is going to be in the playoffs. I do expect them to take care of business during the regular season, even if they do have a hiccup for a game or two in the regular season. But the biggest question now is how they do it in the playoffs. And if they can handle their business in the playoffs and don't forget about what got them there, then they can take care of business. And also one last thing would be, I think their biggest hurdle right now too is the Kansas City Chiefs. They are like that final boss in a video game when you beat every single character, but you got to get to that final boss in order to win. And I feel like the Chiefs is just that.
Real quick, Justin, it feels stupid for someone who covers the Bengals to ask this question, but how confident are you in Lamar Jackson's progression? I mean, he just won the MVP, obviously. Like, he's a fantastic player. I love watching him, even if he torches the Bengals on a biannual basis. But both playoff games that he's been in have not been exactly promising, and he's starting to get kind of like a narrative where he just doesn't perform in the playoffs. From your perspective, for how you've seen him grow in the past 2 years, how confident do you think Ravens fans and the team is in him to really take that next step to lead him into a playoff push?
Me personally, I'm very confident in him. I can understand why, whether it be Ravens fans or other fans of other teams, would not be confident in him, because the biggest thing that sticks out right now is the playoff record, it being 0-2, because that's what matters the most. Regular season is cool. Yeah, he got the MVP. That's cool or whatever, but what are you going to do when it counts the most? Win or go home mode, and they've lost. But in the in his first playoff game, it was ugly pretty much all around. It was disgusting. And he couldn't get anything done. They weren't getting anything done early on and really throughout the game until like the very end. But in this second playoff game, he did make some strides. He did improve. And I noticed the score doesn't really show it that much. But if you look at his numbers, he definitely improved numbers wise. And then there were so many just drops. There were a lot of drops too. Now, every pass that he threw, it wasn't perfect and it wasn't pretty. So a lot of it is on Lamar too, but a lot was on the receivers as well. But I am super confident that Lamar, that he'll be fine. And one of the biggest reasons I think that he'll be fine and that he'll make even more improvement is because last season he sat out 9 quarters. So that's 2 games and 1 quarter. That's the total amount of time that he sat out, because there were a lot of games where he sat out the 4th quarter because the games, they were blowouts. And then, of course, the Week 17 game, he sat out the entire game because the Ravens just played the backups in that game. But he still was able, even with sitting out 9 quarters, was still able to lead the league in touchdown passes, and still had like 1,200 yards rushing. And one thing with him, he has to improve on his throwing to the sideline, throwing outside the numbers and whatnot, just the consistency of it. But another reason that I feel like I'm very confident in him is because of what I saw from year 1 to year 2. In year 1, when he first came on the scene, when Joe Flacco got injured, and I really do think the Ravens, not that they wanted the injury, but I think they played the injury up a little bit because they just really wanted Lamar Jackson on the field. They wanted to go ahead and move forward. It was all love for Joe Flacco, but they wanted to go ahead and move forward. I think Joe Flacco will be a good fit for the Bengals, by the way, just as a veteran presence. Anyway, but with when Lamar first got on the field, a lot of passes weren't pretty. It was rough watching some of them. But one thing that he did very well was make very, very good decisions. And then we saw that improve in his second year. And for him to go from what he was in his first year to go to being an MVP, that's crazy. It's almost insane. And so with his work ethic, with how good he wants to be, and he hasn't even scratched his full potential, I think it's almost scary thinking about how good this kid can be. Now, I know a lot of a big elephant in a lot of rooms is, Lamar Jackson, he runs so much, he's going to get hurt. His play style not sustainable. And I can understand why people would say that if you just strictly look at the numbers and don't watch the games. Because if you watch the games, you will see that with Lamar Jackson, he doesn't take many hits. He does run, he gets a lot of yards, but he really doesn't take many hits. And I mean, you can make an argument both ways that quarterbacks that are actually pocket quarterbacks, it's more dangerous for them. But Lamar, he'll be fine. He takes care of himself. He protects himself. So I'm confident that he'll get even better than he was last year.
Well, that's a scary thought, and I think some of the rest that he got in games last year, I'm fairly certain that both of the Bengals games were where he was resting for quite a bit towards the end of the game. Before we get you out of here, Justin, thank you for your time. I kind of want to get your thoughts just as from the other side of the fence as to what the Bengals have done this offseason. There has been this for this team, at least as we sit here as fans and seeing what they've done from offseason to offseason, it has been a gigantic offseason for the Bengals, and not just because of Joe Burrow. They did a lot in free agency. They did a lot in on the defensive side of the ball, most of which you mentioned the 3 linebackers they drafted seems to be in an effort to corral Lamar Jackson. How do you feel that the Bengals, what they've done so far in terms of the offseason, their outlook, as well as the rest of the AFC North, because it seems to be one of the most competitive divisions this year?
Yeah, I do hope they do get back to being competitive again. And they obviously, especially with releasing Andy Dalton last week or the week before last, that was, everybody pretty much already knew it was Joe Burrow time. But that was really like, okay, Joe Burrow, let's go. Show's all yours. Let's do it. I do like the moves that the Bengals made with whether Joe Burrow was going to come on board or not. They probably would have kept AJ Green. They did franchise tag him. I am not sure if he signed it or not yet, but either way, he'll be a member of the Bengals because I know he got a lot of love for the Bengals and their locker room and whatnot. They're just the city, period. I love how they put Joe Burrow in a position to succeed now. With a lot of young quarterbacks, especially rookie quarterbacks, since they're usually dealing with weapons that were on the team the previous year, and usually teams don't really fully equip them or fully go in on them. But I like how the Bengals really are invested in one Joe Burrow. Of course, they did have a plethora of receivers already. Tyler Boyd, Mr. 4th and 12, still remember. AJ Green, plenty of plays against the Ravens. I love AJ Green though, and Auden Tate, man. That dude, he's not the fastest, he's not the tallest, but that dude catches everything. I love his game, man. And then them drafting short-handed T. Higgins in the top of the second round, and getting ready to re-sign Joe Mixon to the contract. Actually, I'm actually in a Madden league, and I have to play against Joe Mixon in a playoff game, and he's very good. So I'm a little worried about that. But Bengals, they made some moves, man. Of course, DJ Reader. That's a big move to get disruptive up front. They also made one move that I did question. I didn't really like it, only because of the money, was Trey Wayne. I do like you taking a risk on a cornerback, got some speed and whatnot. Hasn't been the best with the Vikings. He did improve toward the end of his career with the Vikings, though. But I just didn't like the money part. And I believe they got is it Mackenzie Alexander from the Vikings too? So that deal was a lot better, but they played it safe. They played it safe with those. That was a much more safe contract though. And if they can, I'm not sure what their status is on the offensive line, but that's where everything starts. That's where literally everything starts. If that offensive line can be right, then you can put Joe Burrow in a really good situation. You can put Joe Mixon in a really good situation. And if Joe Burrow can be as good of a decision maker as he was with LSU, with Cincinnati, then they may not have to wait long to be competitive again. They might not have to wait a long time. Because they, like I said, the weapons, man. The weapons, like you have 4 good receivers, man. You have 4 good receivers, and I'm naive to the depth behind AJ Green and Boyd and Tate and Higgins. I'm not sure who else is there, but you have 4 good receivers in those guys, so you got a lot of options, and you got guys that can beat a one-on-one, or you got guys that can make, especially with AJ Green, and T. Higgins, and all 4 of them. They can make contested catches. So even if they don't beat somebody deep over the top, they can be one-on-one with a cornerback, and they can make the catch over that cornerback. So they got a very nice receiving group, man. So Bengals, they can be like a sneaky competitive team this year. I do think it's going to take a little time to get acclimated to the coaching and whatnot for Joe Burrow to make that jump from the collegiate level to the pros. But I think after a year under his belt, I think more so next year. Next year will be the year where he takes a big jump, and then it'll be like, uh-oh, here goes Joe Burrow.
I think that's kind of the consensus opinion, and the fact that the division is the Ravens to lose at this point. But it does seem as if the gap between the Bengals, the Browns, the Steelers, and the Ravens seems to be, lessened based on what's happened this offseason.
I agree.
Justin, great to have you with us. Thanks for spending. I think I asked for about 10 minutes and you gave us double that. So I can't thank you enough, my man. Once again, I've already seen some comments, by the way, of some of our listeners saying they subscribe to your YouTube channel. So you've got some supporters here. Where else can people find your material? Get you on Twitter. I know we talked about the Ingraven Vids YouTube channel, but just want to make sure we promote what you're doing out there, man.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. Everything, just Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, everything is Ingraven Vids. All just one word, INGRAVEN VIDS. That's it.
Cool, man. Well, you're great at what you do. We appreciate you coming on, and maybe during the season, however that may look at this point, maybe you can come back as we preview one or both of those games. We'd love to have you back, man.
Oh yeah, for sure, man.
Cool.
Sure. I appreciate it a lot.
Thanks, Justin.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for making the time.
Hey, no problem. Y'all have a good night.
All right, you too.
Thanks.
That was Justin from Ingraven Vids. That was cool, man. He's good dude. Very well spoken, and very good at what he does. And you can tell why he's got close to 30,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel.
This is a dude that covers the Ravens, but he had plenty of good things to say about the Bengals. This is why it's important to be objective, because we wouldn't want to come on to his show and be all biased against the Ravens. That's why objective analysis, you guys, is important.
Yep. I'm seeing some people, Anthony, you won't have a Steeler on. Well, we got to get somebody from the Steelers. If we're going to complete the cycle, we got to get someone from the Steelers on. So again, a little bit of a last minute change. We've been trying to schedule Justin over the past couple of weeks. He's a very busy guy, as you heard. He does like daily stuff on his YouTube channel. So he's a really busy guy, and we were able to kind of sneak him in tonight. We didn't think we were able to get him, but he said he was available last minute. So we said, dude, we got to get you on. So we wanted to do that. We will continue with previewing the rest of the AFC North over the next handful of episodes. So check that out and go to his YouTube channel, Ingraven Vids, and subscribe there. We're going to close up here in just a minute, though, but we've got one final segment before we do.
Yeah, so we're going to continue our 9 for 9 series, where we break down the 9 important position groups on the Cincinnati Bengals roster as it stands right now. Last week was our first part of that series. We covered the linebackers, and we're going to go through the same type of structure of the discussion here, but we're going to focus on the second most polarizing group, and one that we already talked about with Larry Warford, and that's the offensive line. So right now, Bengals have, I think, 13, maybe 14 rostered offensive linemen. That includes a couple of undrafted free agents. They only added in free agency Xavier Su'a-Filo. They only drafted Hakeem Adeniji. Basically, like we said throughout this offseason, this is a group that the front office and the team likes more than the fans and other analysts. How much they're right about that is definitely remain to be seen, but it's clearly a group that they want to see this year, a lot of development from these young guys. And we talk a lot about, guys like Fred Johnson and Michael Jordan, but there's still Billy Price there who could potentially make his name as a starter at right guard, or maybe just solidify himself as a solid backup. There's still, Alex Redmond there who, they brought him back for a reason. They clearly like him for what he does. And he at this point, I think you have to pencil in a roster spot for him. So this position group, like Justin said, when you previewed the Bengals, it's going to make or break this team. And it's going to be about their decisions, or their lack of decisions at this position group, is what's going to ultimately sway the season for some part. It could impact heavily on how good Joe Burrow is as a rookie. And it could impact whether or not the offensive line coach Jim Turner is here next year, because you have to think, a guy who basically at this point, this is his group. Like the majority of guys on this roster that will make up this roster is guys that Turner has personally invested time and even money into at this point. So this is a position group that's going to define the season in a lot of ways, and it's also going to define, Zach Taylor's decision making, his decision to even hire Jim Turner in the first place. It's going to tell us a lot of things about it. So right now, I think we have to start with what's the projected starting 5. And I think if you go from left to right, when you start at left, it gets a little more. It's more obvious at this point, but as you start getting to the right side, it gets a little bit more up in the air. So, Anthony, if you had to guess the starting 5 for Week 1, what will your 5 be?
Going from left to right.
Yes.
Jonah, I actually think so. There's kind of been a little bit of a discrepancy as to where Su'a-Filo might be fitting. In terms of left guard, right guard. He's always been a left guard, but there's talk that he would be a right guard with the Bengals in terms of all indications from Bengals.com and where chatter from coaches, etc., that they think he could be a right guard. So that's where I waver a little bit, but I think he's probably going to be a starter for them. And I think even though they didn't pay him a gigantic pile of money, I think they like what he brings in terms of their fit. I think that he's a better and more able pass blocker and than John Miller was. And so that's what they're looking for. So I think I will say for now, I guess I will go Jonah. I see a scenario where Michael Jordan is your left guard. You've got Trey Hopkins at center, and then you've got Xavier Su'a-Filo at right guard. I think you still have – I think this team has committed to Bobby Hart. I think you can talk all you want about the Fred Johnson. I think he's going to have to show a lot, especially in this weird offseason where there may not be a lot of practices and a lot of opportunities for him to shine. Who knows what the preseason is going to look like and if there's going to be actual games then and if he's going to get a lot of time there. I think that they would like to see him turn into a guy that they can rely on as a starter. But for now, I think that's my 5.
The Bobby Hart situation is the most interesting one. I think
interesting is being politically correct, but yes.
Right. With Su'a-Filo, I think you can pencil him in as the starter right guard right now. I think with their decision of how they handled John Miller and the fact that they brought him afterwards and what they've said about him, even though he's never played right guard for more than that he had to play that position for just 1 week. Like, right. He's never played that position, but they seem to be committed to him at this time at that spot. And they really don't have another better option there unless you want to go Billy Price or Alex Redmond. And we know how they perform as a starter. With Hart, though, it's going to play out one of two ways. Either A, like you said, in this weird offseason where you're not going to have a lot of live practice reps before whenever the regular season starts, you may be more comfortable having that veteran guy there who's played the position for multiple weeks in the past 2 years, and you have a good feel about what he is as a starter. And if that's the case, I think he has the shortest leash out of any of the 22 starters on this team. I'd agree with that. If he screws up, I think that they are infatuated with the idea of getting something out of Fred Johnson. Whereas if Fred Johnson isn't right now the starter over Bobby Hart, which could very well be the case, he will be given an opportunity immediately if Bobby Hart continues to be Bobby Hart. Based off of what Paul Daniel Jr. and Jay Morrison are saying, though, it seems to be Fred Johnson's job to lose. And I think it's going to be a rigorous competition where it's going to be 50-50. Either guy could win. But if I had to say right now, based off of what we're hearing about Fred Johnson and the fact that, he was the reason why Cordy Glenn was ultimately benched at the end of the year. They felt comfortable giving him those reps at left tackle, albeit it was against a Myles Garrett less Brown squad and a Miami Dolphins squad that didn't have an edge rusher to boast. But still, he played really well, and I think they like what he brings, and they like who he was coming out of college enough to continue to invest with him. So if Bobby Hart is still the starter penciled in, Fred Johnson's right on his tail, and he's going to be inputted there if Bobby Hart continues to be the lackluster player if he is. But I think right now, Fred Johnson might have the edge based off of because they know what Bobby Hart is, and they know that if Fred Johnson stinks it up, then they can always go back to him. And Bobby Hart shouldn't have this ego where he has to be a starter because he would not be getting as much money anywhere else if it wasn't for the Bengals. So I think based off the things that we're hearing about this, Johnson seems to have the inside track. But again, it depends on, like you said, how this offseason is going to progress and if they're comfortable putting in a second-year guy over a veteran who has multiple years of starting experience.
To be clear, it's not like I was necessarily saying that would be my ultimate preference, my personal preference on that. I'm going on past history. I'm going on some of the things that, that they've shown us and what they've kind of said in kind of so it's kind of secretive, right? I mean, they're kind of like, oh, we really like this guy. I do think that they really like Michael Jordan. They've made no bones about that. And I think that he's a guy that they're going to try and find a place for and continue to develop if possible. Like I mentioned, they brought in Suafilo for a reason, and it's because he can pass protect. And if you watched Matt Minnick's Chalk Talk episode on Xavier Suafilo, there's a lot of stuff in there that actually shows that even though the PFF scores, even though some of the recent play has been up and down, there's some things in some scheme areas where he seems to be a good fit for what the Bengals want to run. I think that they're going to find a starting spot for him. Obviously, they signed Trey Hopkins to an extension, so they really like what he brings at center. My thing is, you mentioned if Hart's the starter, Fred Johnson's right on his tail. How do you feel in that regard about the guard spots? If it is Suafilo and Michael Jordan, do you feel Billy Price is right on their tail? Do you feel some of these other guys, Alex Redmond and others, are right behind them in case there is a slip up of play from these quote unquote starters?
Yeah, and I think Jordan has that left guard spot penciled in for him because of how he played towards the latter part of last season. Obviously, the first part was just abysmal, and that's why Billy Price ended up getting some chances in there. But I think they like the potential for growth in Jordan, whereas Billy Price has had more chances to prove himself, and he just hasn't done that, or has proven himself to be a terrible player. And I think if they could have traded Billy Price and saved some money in the process, I think they probably would have done that. At this point, Price is just too expensive to liquidate. Just 2 years into his contract, I think they just like him as a guy who has experience at center. They obviously need a guy who has backup potential at that spot because they don't have anyone else aside from Jordan who should be starting at left guard. But I think this is a good opportunity for a segue here so we have those 5 or maybe 6 guys who are confident they're going to start. Either tackle is basically up in the air at this point, but we know that those 2 are going to make the final roster, barring anything unlikely to happen. How the rest of the position group fills out, though, how many they keep, 8, 9, maybe even 10, probably more 8 and 9, but they're not going to activate all 9 players. For example, they're probably going to activate a guy like Price because he has experience at center
and versatility. Yeah.
Right. And so then you have guys like Alex Redmond, recently drafted Hakeem Adeniji. One of those guys has at least experience playing tackle, so maybe that gives him the advantage here. But with Adeniji, who has been mentioned in the comment section as a guy that we haven't mentioned because we wanted to bring him up in sort of a separate type of discussion, does Adeniji have a shot to be this year's Michael Jordan, where we didn't really think about Michael Jordan being a starter, in the summer last year until opportunities popped up as a late round pick, a guy with athleticism, one of the only guys that they drafted on or invested in on the offensive line. Does he have a bigger chance to make an impact in case maybe Mike Jordan slips up in preseason and doesn't look to be the guy that they expect to progress into? Does Adeniji have a chance to make his name as more than just a guy that hopes to be active on game days?
I think so, and I think like a Billy Price, even though it's not ideal that Billy Price was a former first-round pick as a backup that provides versatility, I think that initially that's what Adeniji brings, versatility, emergency tackle, but right away could be a guy that's in the mix for a backup guard job and could step in there. And I think that's where a lot of people felt he translated best coming from Kansas and into the pros. They felt that, he's got the skills, maybe the skill set may be more akin to an NFL guard than an NFL tackle, but he does have immense experience at tackle. So, he brings that versatility gene that the team really likes in their offensive line. I may not word this the way that I want, or it may come off a sort of inaccurate, but it seems to me that Jordan was the guy that he kind of had some limited experience himself at Ohio State. Yeah, he's got some starts, but he moved around a little bit. He was more this big mammoth, really young guy that they felt has this immense potential, but they need to develop him. They need time to do that. Adeniji has some athleticism, but he doesn't seem to be the raw athlete or have that immense, necessarily that clay to mold like a Jordan, but he's more technically sound. And that's where I feel that his benefit, especially immediately for the team, could come into play. He may need a little less development than a Michael Jordan because Jordan was so young. He didn't have the 4 years as a starter at tackle like an Adeniji. So, I think there's a little bit of a yin and yang there between those two guys. But I do think Adeniji could be in the conversation, if not pushing heavily for a starting role or a prominent role this year, then definitely next year.
Right. So just looking at the group in general, you have 3 tackles we're confident are going to make the team. 3 tackles that we know are tackles, and Jonah Williams, Bobby Hart, Fred Johnson. Adeniji is in a great spot to make the roster, obviously, because he's going to a team where he's a 6th-round pick, but you like to think that he's, if not a lock, a near lock to make the roster because of how little they have on the offensive line left and the fact that he can play multiple positions. And you're right, he played fairly well at guard at the Senior Bowl for never playing the position in college. So that does bode well for him to not only make the roster, but to be active on game days. So you have Adeniji behind Michael Jordan and Xavier Su'a-Filo at guard. And then you have Trey Hopkins, who's probably the most solid veteran that they have on offensive line at the center spot. Billy Price backing him up. That's 8 guys. The 9th spot, if they keep 9, probably goes to Alex Redmond. But is there a guy that we haven't really mentioned yet who can push Redmond off that spot, or maybe push for that 10th spot?
Well, I think it's a little premature to definitively say or to give a really well-educated guess. If I remember correctly, there's a kid on the team. Is it Isaiah Prince?
Yes.
That kid kind of intrigues me. He was an Ohio State kid, I believe, as well. Was he not?
Yes, he was.
Yeah. So, and I think actually I saw a post that was brought back up from Joe Burrow when he talked about he was going to enter the transfer portal or something. I think Field Yates from ESPN brought that up. And in the comments, I happened to see a comment from a couple of years ago from Isaiah Prince. So that's where I was kind of I got the wheels turning. So, that could be a guy that the team, he's an undrafted guy, probably a long shot, but that's a guy I wouldn't totally write off, especially if the team, is keeping more of the going a little heavier on those swing guys in the interior of the line. Prince could be a guy that, I don't know, may make some noise. Again, it would need to, we need to see some things in preseason and in training camp, I think, but that's a guy I've kind of got my eye on a little bit.
I think if Prince somehow makes the team, that would be at least 4 players from that 2015 Ohio State team.
Yeah.
Technically, won't include Burrow there. They brought in Von Bell. That was Billy Price's, I think, freshman or sophomore year. That was right before Michael Jordan came to Ohio State. But they have a lot of Buckeyes on their roster. And I think Prince was a guy that I think Duke Tobin told one of the beat writers that he really likes as a potential tackle option. So if Prince doesn't make it, I think
that's why I picked him, because of the tackle situation. And he's
right.
not, if they go heavy on interior line, if they view him as a true tackle option, that's why I mentioned him.
And he was in a similar spot to Fred Johnson last year, where Fred Johnson was an undrafted guy who was claimed by the Bengals in the middle of the season. Isaiah Prince was the exact same situation, only Prince didn't get a chance to play. You can say what you want about Prince as a college player. He definitely was like a 5th, or no, Prince was a 5th-round pick, I believe. He was a day 3 pick, I think, somewhere. I'm not exactly sure what team. I think it was the Dolphins that drafted him.
You're right.
Yeah. So he had talent to be drafted, whether or not that's because he was at Ohio State and there's type of bias there, whatever. Anyways,
sixth round by the Dolphins. You're right. Yeah,
he has talent to potentially make a roster, and if it's going to be a roster, it's going to be this one. If it's not him, though, I did some more research on Clay Cordasco, the offensive lineman for Oregon State. I think this guy moves like an NFL player, and it's kind of subjective, I guess. You just kind of just watch film and to see, but I think he plays at a good pad level. I think he plays at a good power. I think he was mainly, I want to say it was a tackle at Oregon State, but I think he has a body type to be a guard as well. So, we know next to nothing about how the rest of this offensive line is going to configure itself as this summer moves on. But if there's an undrafted guy that we're not talking about, I think Cordasco has a better shot than Josh Nibfill, who's the guy from Iowa State, who just, I don't know, he kind of seems more like a practice squad type of guy for me. So, if they do keep 9 or 10, I think Cordasco is a guy to watch there. But at the end of the day, I think you have 3 backups that you're confident can play multiple positions, and that may just ultimately convince them to keep 8 and keep one extra guy at a position group that they're more confident in.
Yeah, I saw on Twitter you had mentioned some things about Cordasco early in the process. So he's a promising guy. It's again, if I think it comes down to, do they want to keep guys that have that swing positional versatility, or did they learn their lesson from last year in their collection of guards and interior linemen and didn't have enough contingency plans in place at tackle? I think that's where maybe the numbers game comes into play.
Right. So that'll do it for this week's 9 for 9 series. And let's go ahead and drop the mic, Anthony. What you got?
I just want to share this. By the way, good stuff on that 9 for 9, John. And that is John's brainchild creation there. So good stuff there. We hope you've enjoyed it. We're going to continue on through all of the position groups. So thanks for taking the lead on that one, John. It's good stuff. I just want to say this. There's been some, and I'm going to put this link in our live chat in case some people have not heard. I guess Auden Tate, his sister, has been stricken with cancer. And he has been promoting a GoFundMe account. And for those who know me and John and have heard the interviews with other former and current Bengals that we've had on this program that are involved in charities, we like to promote those. We like to try and rally support for those if and when available. I know it's always weird asking people for money and hitting people up for money, especially during this time, but he is a Bengals player. Whether or not he ever comes on this program, it doesn't matter. We just want to help him out and get him through what seems to be a pretty tough time for his family. So if you are able to donate, check it out. Send Auden Tate some support, especially if you're on Twitter. Let him know you're thinking of him, even if you give a little bit to this cause for his sister, Doshay McLeod. They've raised about $9,200 so far. I think they want to raise quite a bit more. So it is through GoFundMe. I put the link in the live chat. We'll put it on cincyjungle.com. This is a time that I know it's difficult financially for a lot of people, but these nonprofits, we've said this before, need help because they too are unable to do these in-person fundraisers, et cetera. And then this is not obviously a regular fundraising type of thing. This is kind of an extreme situation. So if you're able to assist, please do check out the link that I provided in the live chat.
I think that's exactly how we should end the show. So I had something to say, but I don't want to. I want that to be the last thing that we all remember from the show. Thank you, Anthony, for that. Thanks everyone for tuning in live or listening to after the fact. We'll be back on a regular schedule next Wednesday, and we will see you then. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks, John. Good show, buddy.